Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, which is now the hallmark greeting in the pandemic era for all webinars. So wherever you are joining from, welcome to this panel of what I consider luminaries that I have the pleasure of moderating, which is called Lighthouse in the Monsoon, and it is about partnerships for 2030. So very warm welcome to you. My name is Maitreyi Bordia Das. I work at the World Bank, and again, it's my pleasure to moderate this panel. Before saying a couple of words about what the panel is going to be about, I would like to introduce my panelists, whose CVs and bios you will find in the on the web in the Raisina site. But I have the pleasure of moderating His Excellency Dr. Tandi Dorji, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Bhutan. Her Excellency Raychelle Omamo, who is the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs in Kenya, Ms. Anne-Marie Yastushok, who is the Chief Advisor to the Acting Administrator of USAID, Dr. Raychelle Glenister, who is the Chief Economist of the erstwhile DFID FCDO now, Government of UK, and Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar, who heads a think tank called the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, amongst his other roles that he has. So with that, welcome to you and to our panelists. I just wanted to say that we find ourselves, and this has become somewhat of a trite welcome to several webinars, but it is true that we find ourselves at a moment that we had not anticipated 18 months ago. And this moment has catapulted the idea of many different ideas, but certainly the idea of what partnerships mean. And the role of partnerships in the 2030 agenda, which is 2030 is barely 9 years away. So how can we leverage the partnerships, not just the traditional partnerships as we have known them, which are political partnerships, but partnerships that range from partnerships with citizens groups and civil society, with academia, the private sector, amongst other types of partnerships. What are ways in which the center of gravity for these partnerships has shifted from what used to be called the global north to more towards emerging economies and the global south? The pandemic has really laid bare a host of challenges, of inequalities, of exclusions, of all kinds of problems that we find ourselves in the midst of right now. So without further ado, I would like to pose my first question to Your Excellency, Dr. Dorji, and to ask you, from the perspective of Bhutan, where do you see partnerships having evolved in the medium term in particular? And what would you like us to take away from the manner in which Bhutan is leveraging its partnerships? Over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Ms. Das. I would like to first say hello to all my fellow panelists, and also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very prestigious Raisina dialogue. I think the topic under discussion is very, very relevant, especially given these times of the pandemic. And as you rightly said, in this era of the pandemic, it has become very clear that we are now in a life very different from what we know, and that the past year has taught us that no country alone can resolve this problem, and that we are all interdependent, and that it is all the more important that partnerships be strengthened and we collaborate in our efforts towards overcoming this pandemic. Now, if you look at the perspective from Bhutan's side, we have been fairly successful in containing this pandemic. And again, this is largely due to the partnerships that we have had. And right from the very beginning, I think one of the most important things that all the countries in the world experienced immediately following the pandemic was in repatriating our citizens. And towards this, we required the support and collaboration of all the member countries. And secondly, I think with the pandemic ongoing, I think it was very important, especially for countries in the south who have limited resources, to access much needed PPEs, testing kits, etc. I think these were the important things. Now, purely from Bhutan's side, since we have since our border is only open with India, I think the partnership that we have with India has been very exemplary. We've always had very cordial and very friendly relation with India, but especially over the last year, with this pandemic, I think this partnership has gone further. And as we talk about emerging economies helping, I think Prime Minister Modi's outreach to all the member countries in the South, especially among the SAARC countries in March of last year, was critical in initiating a dialogue so that we all could support each other, and also establishment of the SAARC COVID Fund. Bhutan has benefited immensely from India's support towards this, especially not only in providing us with much needed PPEs and with testing kits, but just very recently of the very generous support of the vaccine Maitri that India has given to so many countries around the world. And Bhutan has benefited immensely because we were able to achieve over 90% of our adult population vaccinated over a period of 10 days. And this is largely due to the generous support of India. And we hope that the same benefit will be received by all other nations that India has been supporting. And when you talk about the South, I think emerging economies like India becoming stronger and also helping all the other countries, a strong India will only benefit all the other countries that are close to us, especially in the SAARC and in the BIMSTEC region. But no doubt this same support is going also to Africa and much needed countries. As we hear more and more about vaccine nationalism and protectionism, I think the altruistic steps that India has taken has shown a light, especially at this time of the pandemic. And we look forward to growing partnerships in this area, not only in this area, but from now onwards, we will have to look at other forms of pandemic, not necessarily from the health pandemic, but also because of other pandemic, as you mentioned, we have inequalities growing, we have the environment, we have connectivity, we have migration, so many things need to be addressed. And all this really stems from the need for international cooperation and partnerships. So I really think that these are areas that the globe can learn from this pandemic and recover better for a better world.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think you made a really important point, which is that this is not the only pandemic, and what we are seeing in the world is a compounding of risks, and we are likely, unfortunately, to be seeing more outbreaks, if not epidemics and pandemics. So, Your Excellency, Ms. Omamo, I would like you to think and let us know a bit more about how partnerships are being leveraged, particularly in Kenya, but also in Africa as a whole, and how you see this shift in the center of gravity of partnerships towards the development agenda.
Let me just say how delighted I am to have joined you this afternoon to engage in this really important conversation, at least from the perspective for those of us who are on the African continent. One of the things that the pandemic did show us quite clearly is that we need a raising of consciousness about the challenges that we have in our world, and also about the cooperation and the collaboration that we can forge amongst each other to surmount challenges. And this was very well managed and articulated on our continent. As soon as the COVID-19 pandemic began to meander through Africa, we realized that there is just no way in which all of us as small, poor states were going to be able to manage this pandemic alone. And so we quickly gathered together as under the spirit of Pan-Africanism to work together. We strengthened the Africa CDC. We put together an African COVID-19 strategy. We managed to put together a virtual medical supplies platform. We were able to put together teams of experts to go out and negotiate debt relief for us. And now we're working together to try and ensure that we're able to procure as many vaccines as we can for Africa. What was very clear to us is the way Africa is positioned in the world, how we're so susceptible to shocks, how we are unable to manufacture internally, and how many of us have been unable to strengthen our public health systems. Health is a critical component of the SDGs, and therefore our focus must be there. In working together as a collective in Africa, we were able to extend our support to countries in the Caribbean. We allowed them to access their medical supplies through our medical platforms. We were then, as a collective, able also to engage with partners to supply much needed medical equipment, therapeutics, diagnostics to us very rapidly. We formed engagements with countries such as China, such as India. India has been very, very generous in supplying us and donating vaccines to Africa, which has enabled so many African countries move ahead with their vaccine programs. In Kenya, we were able to reach out to Cuba, and they were able to supply us with doctors to strengthen our own medical initiatives with regard to COVID-19. We ourselves were able to supply nurses to smaller countries in our region. What we realized is that there's a power in unity, there's a power in working together, there's a power in merging policies. And these are the seeds of this type of South-South cooperation we need. We're not going to be able to accelerate development, to make that leapfrog that we need to shore up Africa's development, to shore up wealth, to shore up the livelihoods of our people. And it has become very, very clear to us now that the biggest threat to Africa's peace and security are not the wars we're always talking about. It's about things like health, education, climate change, areas where we have to work together collaboratively to make that change. So that has been our experience so far, and I'm quite proud of the work that we did in Africa, because we saw across the world that the whole idea of multilateralism fell apart in the face of this pandemic, and that Africans were able to find a space of engagement in the throes of these challenges, I think is something that we ought to be quite proud about. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think you make absolutely some extremely important points about the manner in which the continent actually came together, and you had make a powerful reference to the collapse of multilateralism during the pandemic and of protectionism, and that's where these partnerships really become so much more important, and they become so much more powerful in order to move the needle away from the pandemic into a post-pandemic world. Thank you, and over to you, Ms. Yastishok. And what I want to ask you is this. We have been hearing about the United States' renewed focus on issues of diversity, inclusion, equity, and we know that the pandemic has laid bare both traditional inequalities and has thrown up new ones. So given the fact that USAID is moving towards a renewed focus on equity, where do you see the partnerships being leveraged towards the completion or achievement of the SDGs? Over to you, Ms. Yastishok.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for having me on the panel. And it's great to see so many of our conversations centering around development. I think you're absolutely right in that President Biden has made diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, a centerpiece of his domestic and foreign policy agenda. And what we at USAID have been doing has been positioning DEI at the front of how we work. But this is a work in progress, and we're not perfect. We're humble about that. And as the international community as a whole, we have a long way to go. But nevertheless, we are eager to really be more in working from our internal hiring practices, our recruitment policies, to ensuring we have a set of implementing partners to make sure that our programs reach and benefit those who have traditionally been marginalized. By prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, it isn't just something nice to do, but it isn't just an add-on. It's really vital to ensure we're maximizing our development impact to achieve the development objectives that we're looking at. So how are we doing it? We really are looking at employing inclusive development approach. And inclusive development is really rooted in the belief that every person, regardless of their identity, is instrumental in transforming their societies. And we take this approach because every person is equally worthy of dignity and respect and should be included in development processes. A second, because inclusive development yields better development outcomes. I think we've seen that through what has happened through the pandemic. And I'd also like to focus on something that my Kenyan panelists also looked at, is also climate change. We really do need to address the inequality in the foundational approach to our climate approach and our climate innovations and interventions. We all feel the effect of climate change, but we do not feel them all equally. And for example, the United States and in many other countries, certain populations are more likely to live in areas with higher levels of air pollution or frequent natural disasters. So we're designing our climate programs to ensure that the voices of the most vulnerable people, the ones who are disproportionately experience the effects of climate change, are front and center. It is their lived experience that should guide us in formulating the most effective and most equitable climate response. I'd also like to say is that, the way that we've worked on the partnerships with the government of India has really made a difference in how we partner. We have worked in India for over 70 years, and every time the Indians the Indian government and the population have moved in their trajectory on their development, we have changed the way we work. And we're also looking at those innovations in our development work, particularly with India, on how we partner in other countries, and particularly in places like the Pacific, that climate change has really had a major impact. And one of the things that Special Envoy John Kerry, in his recent trip to India, highlighted was a new innovation again in our development partnership with India, and that is the establishment of the U.S.-India Gandhi King Development Foundation. So I think, and what that will do is really to catalyze public and private capital toward our shared development objectives, so that we will address climate change, other pandemics, curb air pollution, and its health impact. So I'd like to stop there, but also look forward to hearing the rest of my panel members and hopefully having more of a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yastushok. And what you say is actually music to my ears, as having been a former global lead on inclusion at the bank. I'm hearing the words that we have been wanting to hear, and they're not words, clearly. So really, we'll come back to you on some of that, but you mentioned in particular, allude to, if you didn't mention, a just transition, and I think that's a really important part of how we think about climate. So to you, Dr. Kumar, I just want to hear a bit from you, from the perspective you sit on two major, if not boards, then on two organizations. Both of them are in academia. They're think tanks. They are organizations that drive thinking, innovation. Where do you see some of these partnerships as taking the agenda forward, not just for India, but for other countries in what are called emerging economies / the global South? Over to you, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I want to begin by saying that the COVID clearly has been a very serious disruptor since World War II. I think I want to make the point that inequalities between countries were actually decreasing before the COVID. But I think what has happened now is that we are now, I think, knocked by a double whammy. Inequalities between countries are widening, and inequalities within countries are widening as well because of the COVID. And for countries like India, that is an existential challenge. So I very much echo the view of my co-panelist, Ms. Yatishkop, that really inclusive development partnership is what we should be talking about, not development partnership. I think we should completely rebrand it as inclusive development partnership. Just development in terms of economic growth in which a few people benefit is simply not politically sustainable in most democracies, but particularly India, it's simply unsustainable. So I would make that point. I would also say that in terms of SDGs, since 2030 is no accident, you're mentioning 2030, but it's also the SDG agenda. I also believe that two regions will determine whether we succeed in terms of SDG or not. One is clearly South Asia, with India really proving to be important because of the scale, because of the numbers of people who are below poverty and so on, and you understand that, Madam Chair. Secondly, Sub-Saharan Africa. So I really think these two regions will determine not just SDG, but the fate of development partnership in 2030. Frankly, no other region is going to make an impact as much as does just these two regions because of the millions of people involved. I don't want to be too long because some of the excellent points have been made by others, but you make a good point. I am wearing two hats. Therefore, for me, if you asked me, what are the areas where development partnership will be decisive by 2030, I would say education, and I would emphasize access to quality education. So that's the first. Second, health, but public health. We are not talking health for a few, but public health. And clearly, COVID has exposed the deficiencies in terms of infrastructure in emerging economies, especially like India. So we have to learn the lessons from COVID, and you make an excellent point. This is not the end of the story, isn't it? We're going to have pandemics, whether we like it or not. So the health infrastructure, I would say, is the second, and there I think development partnerships are crucial. Third, I would emphasize sustainable agriculture. This is something that has not grabbed the attention of people, but I'm thinking of my country where almost 50% of the people depend on agriculture. And we've seen some of the challenges of reforming agriculture in India. I don't want to sound political, but we all know what's going on. So I think that is an area we will have to strive for sustainable agriculture. And finally, I would say climate change, and where I think India has taken some initiatives. I was involved with one of them when I was ambassador in Paris, and that's the International Solar Alliance. And it's fantastic that 50, 60 countries have now deposited the instruments of ratification. I think it's a great initiative. And I would say that development partnerships in the future, if you want me to be futuristic, I would say the Quad asking India to produce 1 billion doses of vaccine to be distributed in Southeast Asia, it seems to me that we can make India a hub for strategic pharmaceutical reserves. I think that is a possibility. It is also incumbent on India to share technology and to see if we can actually invest in vaccine producing factories in Africa. That is something that India should be keen to do. But there are some issues. I spent 10 years at the WTO, so I'm aware of the intellectual property rights, and I am aware of some of the challenges we face, but I think there are ways to get around that, frankly. So that is one area. The other area I would really emphasize is that, and which the COVID has brought into sharp relief, is the digital divide, frankly. You know, it's simply, it breaks my heart to know that half the people in India, half the kids in India are just missing out on education because of this. The other half is getting something in terms of, you know, still classes. And I teach online in a university. And even in a private university like mine, where the students are affluent, even there I get complaints from 10% of the students saying, listen, it's not working, so please record your lectures and send it to us. We will listen to it when we get the internet back. So this is, I think, the most serious challenge for countries like India. I'll stop here, Madam Chair, in the interest of time, but I'm always happy to kind of jump in and respond to specific points if you like. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. What you've done is you have really pulled the SDGs into your statement, and to give you a sense, adding a couple of numbers to what you have said. Indeed, the World Bank recent estimates find that the number of new poor is likely to be to the tune of 124 million, 125 million, if not more. And these are people that were not poor in the past. Extreme poverty is going to increase, and you're also very right that the center of activity or action is going to have to be South Asia, with India in particular, as well as sub-Saharan Africa, just by the numbers of the poor that are located here. And that health and education, each of you has mentioned that these are going to be critical, and the pandemic has upended both of these in ways that we hadn't envisaged before the pandemic, even as we knew that these were challenges to start with. So with that, Dr. Glenister, let me turn to you and ask you, from the perspective of the chief economist at FCDO, where do you see the new innovations in data, in research, and how do you see these as contributing to partnerships towards the achievement of the SDGs by 2030, if that is possible? Over to you.
Great, thanks. And I was at the last Raisina dialogues before the pandemic, so feeling very sorry not to be there in person, and also how much the world has changed since we last met. So let me answer your question. If you think about the needs in a pandemic, you know, what became very obvious very quickly is that speed was of the essence. You know, we had to make a lot of decisions very fast. Knowledge. You know, there was a huge hunger for, what is the infection rate? How does this disease spread? Knowledge became a vital commodity, and the magnitude of the response needed to be completely unprecedented compared to what we were used to. Now, how can partnerships help in solving those? I want to talk about 3 examples: debt, vaccines, and education, just very briefly, because I think they pull up different aspects of how partnerships work. Because obviously some of the decisions that had to be made in the pandemic were very national. I mean, you know, nobody should be telling another country the trade-off between lockdown and, that was a very almost personal decision, but it was a very local decision and needed to be made locally with local information of the trade-offs. But other things, knowledge, science, was something that we all benefited. It was a global public good in investing in, understanding, developing new vaccines, for example. That was something where partnerships and coordination was useful and important. Debt debt is an example of, in order to respond effectively, there's huge demand for resources to do, to cover all the needs, the new health needs, the new education needs, provide support to the poor. If one individual country had suspended their debt payments, they would have been hit very badly by the markets. But if we did it in a coordinated way, which is what we did, and it agreed that there would be a suspension of debt payments, then it was, much more palatable and understandable, and individual countries didn't get hit. So we had to, figure out which are the things that we need to do together and which are the things that had to be done individually. Vaccines, again, there's a lot of decisions that individual countries had to make, but there's a global public good on the evidence and the research involved. And I think it's a great example of partnerships. For example, on the AstraZeneca vaccine, where the UK very early made the decision, put significant funding into the research and support the development of the vaccine. But India is the one who's producing it at the scale that is needed. So that was a really good example of partnerships working in a pandemic. But on your question about evidence, turning to the education example, the hit on human capital from this pandemic, I don't think we have yet really recognized. We've been so busy fighting the immediate consequences, but if you look at previous estimates as what has happened as a result of shocks, we could be looking at 15% reduction in productivity long term as a result of the loss of education during the pandemic, at least. So the 15% comes from some work done in Pakistan as a result of schools closing for much shorter than they closed in this pandemic, but schools closed as a result of an earthquake in Pakistan, and people followed up what happened to the children who were close to the earthquake and who were further away. And you see that those children close to the earthquake, where the schools were shut, had losses of learning and losses of human capital that could result in, as I say, 15% lower productivity for the rest of their lives. So the magnitude of what we're talking about, the long-term hit, I don't think we've yet understood. So it's absolutely imperative for us to respond effectively to enable children to catch up with their learning. And this is where evidence is so important, and the support and partnerships are important in building that evidence. So one of the things we're recommending to countries in the catch-up is building on the work actually done in India of developing remedial education, very effective remedial education programs, that where you support children and teach them at the level where they are. And this has been shown to be very effective in getting children to catch up. Now, we developed that evidence, and some of it was funded by the UK, some of it funded by other people, but we developed that evidence as a global public good pre-pandemic, but now it's proving really important that we disseminate that, because we're all facing the need to catch up. The UK is trying to figure out how to get its children to catch up to where they were, but every country on this panel and elsewhere is facing that challenge. So being able to draw on the evidence from everywhere in the world about what has worked effectively. And as the UK, we partnered with the World Bank to set up a group called the Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which is bringing together all the rigorous evidence on education and saying, what is the most cost-effective way to respond? And then use that as a global public good for countries as they plan their post-pandemic response. And that's just an example, I think, of partnerships, developed by an Indian NGO, tested with their support of donors, and then rolled out in many countries around the world.
Thank you, Dr. Glenster. I think what's emerging from the conversation so far are several things, but the last point that you made, and it resonates with what others have said as well, is that there are two things happening simultaneously. One is the need for knowledge, the need for information, the need for public communication. And the other is that we are at this stage with vaccines because of knowledge, because of science. And yet, as Dr. Kumar pointed out, some people are going to be left out of that as well. And as Ms. Jastrashok also pointed out, that's going to be, this catch up is going to be extremely challenging for certain groups of people, for certain countries. And what can we do together to see that there's greater, if possible, not as much of a divergence between those that have been left behind and those that have had more of an opportunity, whether it's because of internet infrastructure or any number of other forms of access features. I'll go one more round, and here I think everyone has heard what the others have said, but back to you, Your Excellency, Dr. Dorji. You are a public health, that's your public health is your technical expertise. Where do you see us? And I'm asking you to read the tea leaves, because Bhutan sits at a very, in a sense, a privileged place. Where do you see, how do you look at the rest of the world? Where do you see a post-pandemic future, especially as far as public health is concerned?
Thank you very much. From Bhutan's perspective, I think the first and foremost is to really look at what we have been pursuing. It may sound a little cliche, but Bhutan has always been propagating the notion of gross national happiness rather than GDP. This hunger for economic development, exhaustible resources are being used, climate change is being impacted. So from Bhutan's perspective, I think this is something that we really need to look at when we talk about global partnerships and the perspective that the world should learn from. I think we should stop going for mere economic growth and look at the well-being and the happiness of the people. That is critical. Secondly, I think in terms of leadership, this is something that the world needs, good leaders that can make good decisions. We have been very fortunate under the wise leadership of His Majesty the King, who has been working tirelessly, not only in this pandemic, but in guiding the way forward for Bhutan. And so really, I think these are very, very critical. Most of us, I think, are speaking the same language, but using different words. And so from Bhutan, as a very small country, we have been very successful in whatever we have done. The amount of inequality is very low, but nevertheless, we are still an LDC country, and there are more things that we can do. But we would like to see the world to collaborate and partner together in terms of what Ambassador Mohan just said, in trade and connectivity and institutions, and most importantly from this pandemic, we must have an understanding on global public good, like the vaccines. Poor countries like us not only do not have the political clout nor the resources to access what is available for the rest of the world. I think here onwards, as we go forward, I think we must, as from a small country, ask the rest of the world to stop for a moment and to think how we move forward in our development pathways. We must look at not only this pandemic, but learn from it to address climate change, environment, inequalities, fairer trade. There are so many things that we can learn. And lastly, just to conclude, I would say that in the words of the DG of the WHO, that no nation and no individual is safe until everybody is safe. And that is the most important thing we need to learn from. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you very much. And I've been given the time signal, so I'm going to ask each of you to respond in possibly a minute and a half to my next point. And back to you, Your Excellency, Ms. Omamo. And I would like to ask you to reflect a bit on what the panel has said and what it means for Africa.
Thank you very much. I think I agree with all the sentiments that have been expressed here this afternoon. But I'd like to follow up on the issue of education that has been emphasized by a number of speakers. What COVID-19 has shown us is that we have to invest in education, and especially for girls. We have found that the pandemic had a great impact on girls' education. Many girls have not returned to school across the continent, because they either can't or they've been subjected to early marriages or, other cultural practices, or simply because they've had to stay at home and look after families. So one of the things that we have done in partnership with the United Kingdom, President Kenyatta and Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we have got together to hold a conference on the Global Partnership for Education. And what we're trying to do is to encourage the world to contribute $5 billion to education so that money can go into rebuilding education that has been broken right across the African continent, right across the world. Unless we are able to skill our people, to reskill those who have skills, to upskill those whose skills are not relevant to the market, what we're going to see is that more and more of us are going to be left behind, and the real victims of all of this will be young women. We need to build an inclusive world, and that inclusive world must be a world in which young women are involved. And their way forward is through education. So I think that's a learning that we need to take very, very seriously as we're trying to build a new world in a post-COVID scenario. I thank you.
Thank you so much, both Your Excellencies. Those were incredible exhortations and clarion calls for the rest of the world. To you, Ms. Yastashok, to respond from the perspective of the United States to these clarion calls that have come from Bhutan and Kenya.
Well, I would, again, just focus that we're at USAID really are constantly evolving the way we work to maximize our development impact. And I think that the representative from Bhutan and from Kenya really laid out some of the issues that we've already discussed on the importance of inclusive development. Because I think you're right, is that we don't know the effects yet of the human capital. And I do agree that in a lot of these areas with education, many of the people who will be left out are the vulnerable populations, including women. And so I think what we need to do is work with countries like India, who's been an indispensable global leader in solving the most urgent development challenges of our era, especially in COVID-19, climate change, and how do we leverage our resources to really do the most good. And I think that when we focus on those lessons for increasing diversity, promoting equality, and fostering inclusion in development programs, we all win. And so we are working really continuously to expand our coalition of partners through governments, the private sector, multilateral, regional bodies, and locally established entities to ensure that we reach our development objectives in innovative and just ways. So I'll leave it there and just once again say thank you for inviting me to take place on this panel.
Thank you. And something we haven't heard, but I'm going to say it, is the slogan of the SDGs is leave no one behind. And it's nowhere more relevant than today. So Dr. Kumar, from your end, some closing words before I turn to Dr. Glenister.
Yes, I just take 1 minute given the interest of time. I have two fears And if you don't mind, I will express them, and I will end on a hopeful note because I'm eternally optimistic. So 2 fears. One, I think multilateralism could have performed better during COVID. This is something we need to accept. It could have performed much better. So that is introspection that we all need to do. Second fear I have is that given the fact that countries of the North have their own issues, I worry about funding from North to South. It's a worry because, you cannot expect legitimately countries to be very generous when they are facing existential issues of their own. This is something that Southern countries need to be aware. Having said those 2 points, those are fears. I end on an optimistic note. While funds may be a problem, what I am really, really keen about is equitable access to technology. That is enough for the South. We don't need money, we will find a way. We don't need human resources, we will find a way. What we cannot do, especially countries like India, is immediate access to state-of-the-art technology. So I'm going to coin a new term, if you allow me, inclusive dissemination of technology with no country left behind is the minimum that I would expect from my northern friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was, again, an incredible exhortation to countries that are richer than others. Last word from you, Dr. Glenister.
Thank you, and such a privilege to be on this group. And Her Excellency Omamo's comments about our joint partnership on the Global Partnership for Education, I couldn't agree with more. It's a fantastic partnership we have with Kenya, and it is doing both, seeking to raise funding for education, but also we are in partnership on the knowledge aspect too, because as Dr. Kumar says, the funding from the North is important and significant, but is nothing compared to what low and middle income countries spend on their own on education. So it's really about passing on, doing what we can to support and build a partnership of understanding the knowledge. And again, a lot of knowledge has come from Kenya about what is effective in education. They are sort of one of the pioneers in testing innovative approaches in education. So it's a partnership of funding, but also of knowledge. And I just wanted to end with one optimistic point and come up, return to Dr. Kumar's point about vaccines and access. I think, we're all worried about access to vaccines, and we clearly don't have enough for the world. A point I've been making since, for a year now is that the solution is greater capacity. The only solution is to build much bigger capacity and the ability to respond in very large scale to this pandemic, but also to future ones. So I think, and then we won't be fighting about access. If you've got a certain amount of supply, it'll always be, one person gets it and somebody doesn't. So the response has to be building the infrastructure of a vaccine supply that can be quickly turned to use, both here, but also for future pandemics. And I think, many countries have a role to play in that. But that's really the solution that we need to be pushing for. And we have built much bigger capacity in vaccines than anybody thought possible a year ago. But we have to go further and faster. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. This time went by very quickly, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize. I will, however, just dwell on just 2 things that both you, Dr. Kumar, and Dr. Glenister said, is on focusing on capacity. I think that focusing on capacity of all kinds, not just the capacity for research or the capacity for vaccines or the capacity for delivering education, but enhancing the supply side such that not just enhancing the supply side, but enhancing it in a way that it can be equitably accessed. Because it's very likely that supply gets captured, or all kinds of things can happen to capacity and supply. As we know, if we think about it as a public good, then there needs to be much more equitable access to supply. With that, let me just say what a privilege it's been for me to moderate this panel at the Raisina Dialogue. And thank you all very much for spending the time and for being here and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.